All right, a story. This young man that we're going to talk about was taken in by a family. And this family made sure all of his needs were met and made sure that he was taken care of. In fact, the father in this family regularly encouraged this young man to think about his career. And different ones in this situation at this time in our world would be encouraged to go into medicine, or encouraged to go into law, or encouraged to go into art. This young man was encouraged. It was a different time in our history. During this period, slavery was widely practiced. And in our story, the young man was a slave to this family. The family was a dad, a mom, and a son. So here this young man came in to be a part of this little family of three. He enjoyed the same living conditions as the son. Archippus was his name. He was paid wages. He was obviously fed and clothed. He had legal rights. And as I said, he was encouraged to pursue a career. The average length of service for a person in that kind of situation was they would serve for 7 to 20 years. This one had just completed his 5th year. That was until he made a terrible, life-changing decision. The family went away on a few-day trip. And so this young man was doing his daily chores, dutifully just taking care of the things that he always took care of, when he happened to accidentally bump a box that he had never really noticed before. Of course, he never would look in it. It was a box in the bedroom of the man and the woman. But when he bumped it, it fell off the table, and it opened, and it was just filled with precious jewels. Where normally he just would have put those things back up and put the box back on the table, this time he hesitated because no one was around. He had been dreaming for some time of his freedom. He was sick of being told when to get up, where to go, what to do. He couldn't remember the last time that he had actually made his own decision about anything. His life felt so controlled and so contrived and so ordered, so not his own. But what could he do? I mean, how could he ever break free from this situation he was in? His parents were no longer living. He didn't have any trade. This family was gracious enough to hire him and pull him in. What could he do to get out of that? Where would he go? Well, with the family gone on this short trip and finding this box of precious stones, this could just be his ticket. So in a moment of rash, impulsive thoughtlessness and thievery, he stole that box, packed a few things, and he had to get out of town. He couldn't stay in this small town. The town was named Colossae. He couldn't stay in this small town because there is no way he could remain in a populated area this small without being detected. He would do better to travel to the biggest city that was closest by, Rome. So that's where he went. This capital city would be filled with foreigners. He could easily just mingle right in and completely disappear, and no one would be the wiser. With this box of stolen treasures, he could easily secure his transportation and get there, and he would have enough for a capital to maybe start his own business, or maybe even make an investment in some venture. The big city was filled with possibilities, but where does he go? Who does he talk to? Who does he ask? He had to keep his eyes and ears open and figure out what was going on. By chance meeting, he met an older gentleman named Paul. Just happened to meet him. There was something about Paul that this young man found so intriguing, he couldn't help but hang around him during the day. Paul was around during the day, walking here and there. He was always surrounded by a bodyguard. And so he ran into him in the marketplace, and then he kind of found out where Paul was going to be. And at night, he never knew where Paul went. Well, he was not wanting to spend all of his precious jewels on lodging, so he was just kind of making it his way for a while. And finally, one day, after he had spent some time talking to this Paul said, why don't you come and spend the night with me? Well, this sounded good to this young man. Our young man, his name was Onesimus. So Onesimus said, sure, I'll come spend the night with you, Paul. And so they walked down this corridor and walked down that corridor, and they walked right into the heart of the town, and they walked into a jail. And the man got real nervous. This young slave thought, oh, the cat's out of the bag, I'm found out. But they walked right into this jail, and in the evening time, the bodyguard that Paul was with, they actually chained their ankles together in the jail at night. And Onesimus thought this was so odd, and Paul began to tell his story. Paul told him one thing after another, who he was, what his life had been like, which direction he had been heading, and an incredible experience that happened one time a long time ago on a road to Damascus. And this story just opened up a whole new world to this young runaway slave named Onesimus. Well, Paul started talking about different parts of his story. He talked about, the young man wanted to know, why are you all the time writing? What are you doing? I mean, I see you writing during the day, and that night you've got all this papyrus paper. You're writing all the time. You've got people writing for you. What are you doing all this for? And Paul explained that he was writing to encourage and instruct these young churches that he had started. And then it happened. Paul told them about a church he had started a few years ago in a little no-name town called Colossae. You could almost feel the blood rush to Onesimus' face. And then Paul did it. He said, yeah, one of the first converts there was a man named Philemon. Now the man was full flush. Paul knew his master. He knew the town that he had run away from. He thought, okay, I'll spend the night here. And then the next morning, as we're just kind of going through the day, I'll just kind of slip away and I'll run again. But there was something about Paul that felt so safe. He knew Paul could be trusted. So late in the night, in that jail cell, Onesimus decided, in humility and in brokenness, to confess all. And the old man Paul listened to every word. And as Onesimus finished his story, Paul opened up his arms with tears in his eyes and beckoned Onesimus to come near. And they hugged, and Paul just poured words of forgiveness into this young slave's heart. The older man told him all about Jesus, his birth and his life, his death, his resurrection, his appearance, and even his ascension. And these words were nothing less than words of life to this young slave. And then Paul said, I need you to get me a piece of papyrus. I need to write a letter to your master. And Onesimus thought, oh no, what's going to happen? And so Paul had one of his secretaries that was there. I didn't tell you, Paul had a personal physician named Luke that was with him. And there was another couple of disciples, one named Timothy, one named Tychicus, a couple of other guys that were just around. Paul beckoned one of the guys that would do a lot of the writing for him and said, here, write this down. And so he wrote this letter to Onesimus' master. Dear Philemon. The words hit Onesimus with a dread because Paul said, I need you to take this letter back to to the family that you would run away from. You need to make these things right. He said, I'm going to help you out. One of the guys that's with me, named Tychicus, I'm going to send him with you. Now, you're going to carry the letter, Onesimus, and one of my disciples is going to go with you. You need to just trust in your newfound master. Oh, by now, Onesimus had completely surrendered to Jesus. You know, the most common sentence for thieves back then was crucifixion. And Onesimus thought, Paul just told me that Jesus was crucified between two thieves. That's going to be my future. I go back, I'm found out, but there was something new in Onesimus' heart. This young man knew that whatever awaited him, he wouldn't be alone. His newfound master, he knew Paul's words were right. He knew that Jesus wouldn't leave him, wouldn't forsake him. That somehow, even in this, he wouldn't be alone. Well, upon arrival back to his hometown of Colossae, his heart was just about to beat out of his chest. He wondered, how would he be received? How would this family he had so badly wronged, what would they say? How would they respond to this old man Paul's letter? Well, they knocked on the master's door. They were greeted by a newly acquired slave who brought them into the house. It was the Sabbath, and there was a whole group of believers in a large room in Philemon's house worshiping. Well, when Philemon set eyes on his fugitive, runaway thief of a slave, he immediately lost his frame of mind of what he was worshiping, and he ordered him out. But Tychicus, who was with him, said this, Philemon, Paul, he has written you a letter, and he sent it with us. He asked that you would read this and share it with the church that meets here in your house. Something wonderful has happened to your slave, Onesimus. Take this and read it, please. Well, what could Philemon do? In his anger, he unscrolled that papyrus, and in the presence of his wife, Apphia, and his son, Archippus, Philemon read out loud Paul's letter in front of the gathering and his fugitive slave, Onesimus. Here's the letter on the screen. By the way, this is one of the books in your New Testament. I, Paul, am a prisoner for the sake of Christ. Here with my brother Timothy, I write this letter to you, Philemon, my good friend and companion in this work, also to our sister Apphia and to Archippus, a real trooper, and to the church that meets in your house. God's best to you, Christ's blessings on you. Every time your name comes up in my prayers, I say, oh, thank you, God. I keep hearing of the love and faith you have for the Master Jesus, which brims over to other Christians. And I keep praying that this faith we hold in common keeps showing up in the good things we do, and that people recognize Christ in all of it. Friend, you have no idea how good your love makes me feel, doubly so when I see your hospitality to fellow believers. In line with all this, I have a favor to ask of you. As Christ's ambassador and now a prisoner for him, I wouldn't hesitate to command this if I thought it necessary, but I'd rather make it a personal request. While here in jail, I father a child, so to speak, and here he is, hand-carrying this letter, Onesimus. He was useless to you before, now he's useful to both of us. I'm sending him back to you, but it feels like I'm cutting off my right arm in doing so. I wanted in the worst way to keep him here as your stand-in to help out while I'm in jail for the message. But I didn't want to do anything behind your back, make you do a good deed that you hadn't willingly agreed to. Maybe it's all for the best that you lost him for a while. You're getting him back for good. And no mere slave this time, but a true Christian brother. That's what he was to me. He'll be even more than that to you. So if you consider me a comrade in arms, welcome him back as you would me. If he damaged anything or owes you anything, chalk it up to my account. This is my personal signature, Paul, and I stand behind it. I don't need to remind you, do I, that you owe your very life to me? Do me this big favor, friend. You'll be doing it for Christ, but it will also do my heart good. I know you well enough to know you will. You'll probably go far beyond what I've written. And by the way, get a room ready for me because of your prayers. I fully expect to be your guest again. Epaphras, my cellmate in the cause of Christ, says hello. Also my co-workers Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke. All the best to you from the Master, Jesus Christ. You imagine reading that letter out loud in front of the guy who's just badly wronged you, perhaps in the presence of a church that was meeting. Now, I took a little bit of liberties in telling that story. I made up the treasure box because I thought, well, a lot of scholars think that he stole something. Maybe what it is, he stole his lack of right to leave. Maybe that's what he stole, but I don't know. Treasure box just makes it sound a little more interesting to me. So I kind of made that part up, and then the part about how long he had served with the family, we don't know how long he served, but I just said 5 years. I just kind of like that anyway. But the rest of the story, it's based on some truth. You know, when I read something like that, there's this thing inside of me that just says, can you believe the transformation that God is able to do in lives? I mean, first you have Paul, who is in prison, and he actually becomes a spiritual father to a runaway slave. That's pretty amazing. And the second transformation that I see here is we've got obviously a runaway slave that's now becoming runaway with Christ. He's becoming a follower of Jesus. And then the third transformation is we've got this just slave owner named Philemon, who now is becoming a merciful slave owner. Jesus takes us where we are. He just refuses to leave us there. There will be a transformation when we walk with Jesus. Abraham Lincoln one time was approached by a wealthy man who really wanted to file a suit against an impoverished debtor who owed him $2.50. Now I realize back in the mid-1800s that was a little bit more than it is now. But needless to say, Lincoln tried to discourage this guy from pressing charges against this impoverished guy. And the wealthy man wouldn't let go of it. So Lincoln said, all right, I'll take up your case. And the wealthy man said, well, what are your legal fees? And he wasn't a president. And Lincoln at that time said, my fee is $10 for taking this case. So the rich man gave him $10. And then Lincoln went out on his own and he took half of his legal fee and he gave it to this man who owed the debt. He readily confessed to it, took half of what Lincoln had given him, paid back the $2.50, and the case was closed. So what we have here is the debt being paid by the third party. The fee was given to Lincoln, who gave it to the poor man, who ended up giving it back to the wealthy man. In fact, if the wealthy man would have found it in his heart just to forgive, he wouldn't have been $7.50 poorer. C.S. Lewis said, everyone thinks forgiveness is a lovely idea until he has something to forgive. Pretty true, isn't it? Forgiveness is tough because it affects all of us. And it will be purchased with something that we are holding on to. That's why this story is all of our stories. In fact, Martin Luther said, when it comes to Jesus, we are all his Onesimus if we really believe it. Look, Onesimus, the name literally means useful. I wonder if Philemon's family renamed this servant when he came to work for them. I wonder if they said, man, we need to call this guy useful. That's what we would name him were we in that situation. Onesimus literally means useful. And what happened to Onesimus? What happened to useful? He became the opposite of his name. In fact, Paul Paul makes a play on that in his letter to Philemon. Look again at verse 11. Formerly he was useless to you, but now he has become useful both to you and me. Paul explained that this fugitive slave had been transformed. The one named useful became useless, but now he has become useful again, both in name and in nature. His newfound usefulness is because of his newfound faith in Jesus. And Onesimus' transformation, the second part of this, included all the way going back to his hometown where he had done things wrong in order again to do things right. Now look at this quote on the page, on the screen. Christianity is not out to help a man escape his past and run away from it. It is out to enable him to face his past and rise above it. Paul is literally saying to this runaway slave, Onesimus, you must go back and face the consequences of what you did. And because of your newfound master, Jesus the Christ, because he's promised to stay with you, you are going to be enabled to rise above it. Christianity is never escape. It is always conquest. It's much more on the move. It's not about shrinking back. It's about moving forward in Jesus. And Onesimus came back a changed man. He ran away a fugitive and a slave and a thief. And he came back a man now trusting completely in a Savior. And the third transformation, I think, is equally impressive. Philemon's heart of justice transforms into a heart of mercy. God made it clear that sin brings death. You need some scripture to back that one up? Y'all know this to be true. Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 4, the soul who sins is the one who will die. Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin, you could quote this, is death. Romans 5:12, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. We all can identify with Onesimus. We all have broken God's holy law. We all are under a death sentence, and we all face a debt impossible to pay. Do you know we have some ancient church fathers who lived right after all of this was written, who lived right after Paul wrote this letter to Philemon? One of the church fathers is a guy named Ignatius of Smyrna. And in his writings, he actually wrote to the Ephesian church, I received your large congregation in the person of Onesimus, your pastor in the world, a man whose love is beyond words. And John Knox, the great scholar, said that Onesimus, this same Onesimus, now a church leader in Ephesus, collected and published the Pauline letters, including the one to Philemon, in which obviously he had a personal stake. In other words, Philemon's forgiveness of Onesimus' wrong was helpful in the continuing process of Onesimus being transformed. And it becomes a powerful influence and a great church leader. The Christian must always welcome back the person who has made a mistake. That's our thing. Now, the natural tendency for us when we're wronged is we are to be highly suspect. That's the way our nature responds. When we're wrong, oh, let's wait just a second. And we're very, very reserved on ever offering trust. But the way of Jesus, our Master, is to receive someone who has made a mistake without hesitation and to immediately flood them with love and trust. Being followers of Jesus puts us whole hog in the forgiveness business. One scholar said it this way: we should be expert forgivers. It is our occupation. We are to be professional forgivers. It's one of our marks of distinction. And all of this ties so strongly to our theme of purchased redemption. Forgiveness doesn't come without cost. For God, the cost, it was literally out of this world. Jesus' sacrifice on the cross purchased the consequences for our sin. God is merciful because Jesus took our place. That allowed God's mercy to have a path. God's justice can't forgive without the sin being paid for. So God's mercy found its way to us through the sacrifice of Jesus. That is what purchased means. Redeemed. And any wrong that we suffer from others pales in comparison to our sin and the offense of our sin to God. But even so, forgiving others will cost us something. You know what? You know what it might cost you? It might cost you some of your possessions. It might cost you having to let go of some grudges. It might cost us having to let go of some ill will that we have toward other people. It might cost us having to let go of what might have been, who we might have been around, what we might have owned, how we might have lived. It will cost us something, but will we let it go? Will we be people identified as unconditional forgivers? That's City Point Church. I'm telling you what, they forgive people quicker than anybody else. Corrie ten Boom likened forgiveness to a bell on a rope. You know, in the old church buildings, when the bell would be up in the steeple and you would grab onto that rope and you'd pull it, usually, unless it's a short rope and the bell is real small, usually it doesn't ring with the first or the second or third or the fourth tug. Because that huge bell, it takes a little bit to move it enough to where the clapper inside clangs against the inside of the bell. Usually you have to move it. You pull on that boat and, on that rope and it moves a little bit, and then it moves a little more, and it moves a little more, and then finally the clapper starts nailing it. Well, Corrie ten Boom said forgiveness is really like letting go of that rope. And the bell will continue to ring for a little bit because of the momentum of that huge thing. But after a little bit, it'll get smaller and smaller in its movement, and then it won't be enough for the clapper to reach the inside or the other. And it'll stop. She said, forgiveness is kind of like that. When the wrong is done, we're ringing the bell. And we still feel it. And even when we let go of the rope, it still rings for a little bit because we're still hurting, we're still stinging. But after a while, the momentum of that offense begins to lose some of its motion. And it stops ringing and the bell moves a little bit. So the issue is for us, what are we going to let go of the rope? Well, we're just going to say, it just doesn't matter. Which of these three transformed lives do you line up with most right now in your life? Now, I realize at different times in our life, we'll be all three. Are you the first one? Are you kind of like Paul, where you're being called in to mediate between two that are having a real issue? It might be that you're needed to cover for somebody's mistake. It might even be that you need to offer to pay for somebody else's indebtedness. Paul's willing to do that. Would you be willing to be a mediator that would really lose some of the things that you hold dear in order to make things right between two other parties? Or maybe you're Onesimus. You're the one who's needing to go back and to make things right with somebody that you've done wrong. Is the Spirit speaking to you right now on that? Is there something that you're supposed to do? Or maybe you're Philemon. You're the one who has been wrong. And it's just time to let go of the rope. Maybe you're the one that instead of having I've got a heart of justice, and justice is near the heart of God. He is a just God. But He's equally a merciful God. And He's wanting our hearts of justice because we have received so much mercy. He's wanting our hearts of justice to turn into hearts of mercy. There's an old story. This doesn't really fit because I wanted to go to something that really touched your heart. But this is such a funny story. I had to tell you this because I think it makes a good point. There's an old story about a Spanish patriot named Narvaez. Any of you have heard of him before? He was lying on his deathbed, and Narvaez, the priest, came in to to read Narvaez's last rites and to take any final confessions that he had. So the priest asked him, he said, Narvaez, have you forgiven all of your enemies? And Narvaez looked puzzled and he said, Father, I have no enemies. I've shot them all. I'm wondering, have I emotionally just shot the people that have done me wrong? And I've just written them off? And when they may make attempts to make things right with me, have I just kind of drawn my line in the sand and said, that's it, I don't care. I don't want to have any connection with you ever again. In this transformation, am I the one that's needing to go ask forgiveness? Am I the one that's supposed to extend forgiveness? Am I the one that's to mediate between the two? This whole transformation process, how is that going for you? Are you being transformed into the likeness of Jesus? Your soul was purchased at a great price. Isn't it time for us to share what's been given to us? Let's pray.